Note that this story is a little bit different and can be thought of as a prototype of what would become my novel, Uploaded Fairy. In that version of Uploaded Fairy, that was my original NaNoWriMo novel. And it was back when I was still trying to write cyberpunk by writing a subset called Dreampunk. However, turns out I wasn't actually the one that invented the concept of Dreampunk, which is kind of interesting. But this is the original story that later became expanded into a 10,000 to 20,000 word story from. And that was before I created the Hamato Tomato version. Anyway, this is the story called She Was the Wolf and I Was the Sheep. Richard stared at the teacher, an inhuman mass of electronic pixels. He reclined back into his seat, dreaming good dreams of completing his home project when he got home. It was a robotic dog he had been working over the past week. He could not afford a real pet at this time. The machine printed letters across the screen and took roll call. It came around to him, and his mind was a little bit dim, so a female student woke him up. He was a fuck-up who stayed under. "Wake up, you don't want to miss the anthem," she said, with a smile fake enough to break glass. He was unresponsive and jolted out of his seat by a sudden beep. It beeped out of control. Disoriented and shaken up, he stared at the screen. The monitor was playing a music video of the new national anthem. After the other students got back into their seats, math class began its session. The electronic teacher printed out math worksheets. He stared into space in a wonderful place while working on boring pre-algebra. He drifted off into a daydream, imagining himself with his new pet once completed when his mother, Julene, was gone for work. At the end of class, the bell rang, and the students rushed out of the classroom. He walked out of the door, but his arm was grabbed by his childhood friend. "Hey, wait," she said. "Brett, I'm busy. I need to get to class," he said. A sweet girl, a mostly innocent one, but she was dumb. Richard had to keep an eye on her at lunch to keep others from stealing her food. But eventually he realized she could not be helped, so he broke up with her. "You never talk to me," she said. Richard, a nerd boy, brushed off with a cold shoulder and rushed to class. "Hey, wait up," Brittany said. Her echo, going in one ear and out the other, was muffled by other students talking in the hall. He arrived to class 4 minutes before the bell. He was already seated when Brittany arrived at class. The monitor printed off letters onto the screen. "Tardy 2, the social studies monitor said. "There's no use making excuses to pixeled glass." "Don't worry, Brett," Richard said. "The computers that printed off paddling permission slips are not in commission." "Sometimes I'd rather take that. It takes less time." "Believe me, you don't, unless you don't mind not sitting a day." Richard was riding a school bus, which was silver and sleek, at a comfortable speed and a lulling motion that puts you to sleep. It had a leather-seated interior with bright windows shining. He was sitting in his seat listening to rock music while reading Hamlet. Hamlet, a play written by Shakespeare, it was a trite mess that lulled him to sleep. He almost nodded off and began to do so. It was a dusty book that was wrinkled, which caused him to choke and cough. an old book written by an author before the invention of prose. A boy sat beside Richard, who wore big, thick black glasses and had a fairly new book about ghosts. His long, trimmed platinum blonde hair and blue eyes Richard could not help but stare deeply into. A boy from a high grade tried to bully his friend, but Richard got up and smacked him in the balls with his left. Come on, comrade, that's not how you treat brothers, Richard said. He could see the bus driver staring through the rear view mirror. What's going on back there? The driver asked. He had a stern look that could stare into your soul. The mixed words between both students, jumbling into a jargon mess, confused the driver. So he hovered above the city sidewalk and pushed both of them out of the bus. Richard tried to get a word in, but the driver closed the door. The flying school bus flew into the sky once more. Richard had to walk home, and he worried that he would not be home in time for curfew. Then he would earn another lecture from Mom. He arrived at the door of his apartment flat and pressed the code to open the door. He slammed the backpack on the table, then walked into the kitchen to grab some mushroom soup. Tossing it into the microwave, he then sat at the table to do his homework he did not finish in class. His mind drifted as he wrote down pre-algebraic notations. His cell phone, and he opened it to see who was calling. Brittany was the one on the other end. I thought I told you not to call me anymore, Richard said. I'm sorry, I just wanted to let you know. I decided to see if I could bribe a teacher to see if I could get SWATs instead of a detention on detention day. And how did that go? I don't know yet. I hadn't gotten an answer. And this is what you wanted to call me about? Yes? Don't call me again. Richard pressed the button to hang up his phone. Richard placed his cell phone back into his pocket and then received another phone call. God damn it, Brett. He picked up his phone, getting ready to yell, but it was a voice he recognized that was not Brittany. It was his mother. Hey, Richard, I'm not going to be home till late tonight. Oh, okay. I have a thing I need to work on with a client, Julian said. She worked as a politician for a local government office. I'll see you at 9, unless you decide to stay at a friend's house without me knowing. I'm home, Mom, Richard said, resisting a chuckle. Take care, sweetie. Bye, Mom. Richard said as he hung up the phone. He finished up his soup and his homework and headed to his room to watch the hologram television. He turned it off, but nothing but junk was on television. His thoughts turned off the television. Richard pulled out of his seat of his wooden desk, which was not really wood, but rather an industrial plastic wood purchased cheap by his mother. He took out his tool set, and what was the beginning of his robotic dog began to form. Richard tinkered with his toy. Julian did not come home that night, which caused Richard to worry a little bit. He took out his cell phone to call her, but there was no answer. He had a sinking feeling in his gut that something happened. He put up his toy and went to bed. The next morning at the bus station, he tried to push by the crowd and get on, but the driver said he was not allowed to fly that morning. Richard looked glum and irritated and walked to school that morning, arriving 3 hours later than he would have otherwise if Julian could have drove him. Richard was in third period late morning when the intercom called him into the office. It was the same old thing, children going ooh when someone was in trouble. He walked through the hall and wondered if it was about what went on with the bully yesterday. Instead, it was something different. Richard was sitting at the desk in the office of the principal. Another monitor with a monotone voice. Two officers were standing beside the screen, looking sternly. We saw the threat you made against the bully. Now I can explain. Don't bother. You're going to boarding school for another reason. The computer flickered in and out, and you may have noticed your mom did not return to your home last night. How did... We have ways of spying on you, Richard. The computer flickered. We know all about you on a registry. Your mom died last night in a hospital robbery. Enjoy the rest of the day, then pack your bags. The rest of his day was quiet. Richard rode in a prison van along with the bully from school, with darkly lit lights other than the windows that passed by the city. He was going to a private school in Hudson, New York. This was the first time he would be going to a different school. He had no idea whether he would make new friends or what would happen, but there was one thing certain. It would not be anything like he has ever known. No more family, no more parents who he knew loved him. Richard and the boy went through an admissions officer to get into the school, and they packed up their stuff in their dormitories to stay for the school year. For the first time in his life, Richard was scared. He was scared that his father would try to kill him, or worse, take him back to his boarding school. There he would be placed back in solitary confinement until he turned 18. Along the ledge of the road, he could see rows and rows of roads in the city highway, and at the bottom a large dead tree with its branches broken off. They were sharp enough to puncture your skin, like someone pushing him off the ledge. His foot slipped and he clung to the edge of the road. His father tried to rescue him, but instead his hand was too weak from running to hold on any longer. The boy slept. A long ways down, Richard came falling down. It was like falling into a black hole of death, and at the bottom a spiky pit. In a sudden stop, he blacked out from a sudden puncture of pain. In his remaining waking moment, he was bleeding. He was dying. Good fathers don't let their kids die, and Edward wanted to shoot himself, but he was prevented from doing so by other SWAT police. She was the wolf and I was the sheep. An uploaded fairy prototype. Second part. Power drills with blindingly shiny metal are spinning many times per second. A loud noise whining with a boring tool, which was going into the boy's flesh, melding between metal and meat on the amputee, who was screaming loudly with his puncture motion. "Ah!" Richard screamed. The pain was intolerable. He became man and machine, a partial boy made whole again, standing up from the surgery table. He had major pain walking. He was a hunk of metal and flesh. Lonely hallways with lights buzzing in a run-down hospital. There was a human odor of a highly pungent smell of death. It reeked up from its tomb of pillows and used scalpels, with the imprint of lost souls left behind that stinks. A muted colored sky raining above endless rows of roads. Cars are flying at lightning speed among neon lights. Malcolm held Richard up by his back. as he almost stumbled. Like a good friend, he would make him return the favor. A cool breeze blowing in the sky, a smell of dumpsters and dead rats. Dead rats, a health hazard, inedible and diseased, a symbol of starvation and death. It was a sickening sight, and he was hungry, cold, and wet. He avoided the dead litter on the ground to keep from being infected. They were rotting, ravaging, and unclean. The Grim Reaper took what it wanted, an insignificant speck of dust. At the time of his first accidental visit here, he could hardly breathe. Like someone with a brain injury, his speech was mumbled. Malcolm paused to listen to him, but could not understand a word he was saying. How did things come to this? All he could remember up to that point was being on a ledge, and the moment of an abrupt fall. It's not the fall that gets you, but rather the sudden stop. He went pop under the concrete, and at that moment felt complete. His vision at the time began to completely fade, and everything as he hoped would soon come to an end. This was his last youth song. For a moment, his vision came back, and felt more pain than he ever had in his life before. The sound of buzzing and whining metal was absolutely obnoxious. It felt like a moment in hell. An eternal darkness, a low-toned bell, and then, staring into a clinical stare, his vision was eventually graced to the light of buzzing ceiling light. Well, look who decided to wake up today. An old man that looked about 50, had a high hairline with long white hair. Your little girlfriend will be happy to see you when you're out of recovery. And then soon passed out as soon as the pain from his whole body was simply too much to bear. For many weeks, Richard was somewhere in between the world of dreams and the waking world. Demonic faces, many graces upon the flesh biting into him, tearing into his flesh each moment. He was reassured by the doctor that the pain would soon be over. Richard did not care much what his name was at that point, simply wanted the pain to be over now. After the weeks went by where he felt ill, eventually he was let go, and that's how he came to live in what would soon be known to him as Purgatory. Purgatory Road. It was a lonely existence, and the first night he woke up upon the couch. The pain was only made more tolerable by the fact that he was no longer in a period of extreme pain. He had a craving for the pain powders, and wanted to swallow that like it was clam chowder, and consume whatever it was as was able to make the pain from the cuts and the growing infection of his flesh go away. But there was no way to get Bianca to give in to letting him buy pain meds. At least at the moment. You need to find yourself a job like everybody else. I can ask Malcolm to see if he can set you up. Maybe things will get better, he thought. But it would become much worse. It soon became apparent to Bianca that it was simply too difficult for him to move at all. Even if Richard wanted to find employment, if not to find another way to kill himself, then by finding some drug to completely kill his perception of mental anguish. So the meeting was set up like this. Malcolm sat on the chair facing in his direction. So what are you willing to do to earn a little bit of extra money to help pay the rent? Malcolm said. Bianca, who had already been on thin ice with him by now, simply glared at him. What? He's got to know the truth at some point. But eventually he was guilted into changing his tune. I can set you up with cleanup duty on the last day of your recovery. As soon as you're ready to go, I'll show you what you will need to do. It was another week. At that point, he had just gotten done with healing and getting used to his new robotic arm. Because he was still not yet used to the motion, it continuously made the herky-jerky motion while he tried to use the broom. But let me tell you, trying to control a foreign body your body wasn't used to is just about to soon be rejected with your brainwave. Was a lot easier to try to chew on sandpaper. Every single time it was a struggle not to ram the stick into the wall. God damn it, not that shit again. But eventually he was able to get the hang of it. This was Olin's beginning of his troubles. After he had finally gotten used to using his robotic arm, him and Bianca started to get a little bit closer, and she had finalized her breakup with Malcolm. But they were still a little bit rough around the edges. Richard remembered one night in particular that would ultimately spell the end of his life as he knew it then, and lead up to the life that he now knew it. It was on that night when he wanted to buy himself a new bottle of immunosuppressant pills. Bianca was on her cell phone, possibly talking to her then ex-boyfriend Malcolm, who was away at work. He worked the graveyard shift always, and set their relationship adrift. As he yammered on the cell phone, Richard tried to concentrate by plugging into his forehead after taking out his holodeck. His pink screen came up, and then he waved his fingers across the screen to get onto the network. I want these, but they are too much. Then he pushed the window away, deplugged from his forehead. One could hear the buzzing down of the system. At that particular moment, he could hear what sounded like her speech at the table in the kitchen. "Are you talking to me, Richer?" said Bianca, his now ex-girlfriend. He was pretty sure that she was sitting at the table. Her action of hanging up was so specifically Bianca. "I did not know you had a phone." If she was watching me as often as she would not know that he did not have one. I was. Her tendency to interrupt was made easier by Richard's physical state. He felt like the couch itself. At that moment, which came sooner than he wanted, he felt a narrowing of his own inner thoughts. For the pain from his robotic arm was too much to bear, and he no longer wanted to think about her or anything else. "Don't talk to yourself, Richer," she jeered. Up until that point, she had chosen not to talk very much, so why in the hell she wanted to talk to him right now, Richard had no clue. At the moment, he would rather have spanked her with one of her shoes, as it would have broken the silence that was between him and her over the particular week that would begin the story that he is about to recall to us. Walking into the lonely, quiet kitchen where the only other person was him and Bianca, the room was merely lit by the glow of the flickering LED light. He walked over to the fridge in order to get a glass of water. He had to have something to quench his thirst, to distract from the true physical pain. "So, Bianca, you've just now decided to talk to me. It's been so quiet here, and with your boyfriend," he began to say. "That's X to you," Bianca said. "Fine then, fruit pie, X." working the night shift, who is going to talk to me. Though in retrospect, now Richard felt a little bit funny about saying that. Whether that would be the case if she complained, he wasn't sure. I do want to talk about your pill, but I need them for my physical pain, fruit pie. Would you stop calling me fruit pie? It was not the name fruit pie that made her want to die, though that did not help her thinking of him like a bug and made her want to try squashing him. Yes, but are you? I just don't feel like talking this week. Bianca just stared at him, with her gaze that was a mixture of loneliness and absolute complete disdain. It made Richard feel profane, and he wondered why it was she who chose to call for an alarm all those years ago. He felt like his soul was lost in the fall. Just break the silence every once in a while. That's all I'm asking for, okay? And then Richard walked back to the couch and said goodnight on his brain-jack deck and played the slow melody of nature music. The sounds of deserts blowing, the sound of ocean torrents, and the call of the wind. Bianca still tried to talk to him while she was in the kitchen. Richard tried to tune her out, but part of him still wanted to listen to her speak. Malcolm is not going to be home till late again. I tried telling him to leave that business, but he simply will not listen. I guess it's his fault if he gets shot. Richard thought, "Lady, I hope you rot." Richard had never seen her like that before, and wondered if there was something she remembered, something that she was not telling him. It always seemed like she was still more attached to him, Malcolm, than Richard, even though she was apparently still dating Richard at the moment. So Richard burst open the bedroom door, causing his robotic arm to jerk and twitch. Man, that hurt like a bitch, he thought. Their bedroom they had together was theirs to share. For many weeks there was no other care in the world. Everything seemed to fade away at the sound of a goodnight kiss in dimmed lamplight. There were no other gadgets, no consoles for people their age, no toys other children their age would like to play with. The song of lost youth. Only the rotten floor that it was still a wonder why one had not fallen through it. When their parents died, there was nothing left for them. Nothing they had inherited. Nothing but the stained earth. Walking up to the window, Richard saw the sky. A sunlight that never went through the thick gray clouds. He could hear her clog stops, and she walked beside him at the window. Hey, I'm sorry about that. I've just been a little bit stressed out lately. So, what are you looking at? Richard pointed to the sky. What do you think it's like? Like where? In the city up there. Dream on, okay, Bianca said, hugging him tightly, which once again caused his robotic arm to twitch. She eased off as soon as she noticed she was hurting him about a whole minute later. That was years ago. I still have no idea where you came from, but this is your home now, Brogy. Covering up her face, she crouched on the floor. Richard stared into the sky. Are you ready to order? Richard heard the waitress say, as gradually as the vision from inside his dream began to fade away. He could distinctly remember various advertisements playing over in his brain over and over again. Yeah, I'll take a coffee. Richard was not sure whether she would understand what he was saying, with him being drowsy. He ordered, ate, and then exited. Then after going through the sliding glass doors, he tried to remember what it was that made him want to remember what those ads specifically were. Were they ads from when he was plugged into his deck? He got the impression that only worked when plugged into the network. Bianca was outside to greet him in the thick green fog that covered the sky. He saw her take a pain powder herself, choking and snorting on it after accidentally taking a breath into it. Fumes were tossed in the direction of Richard's face, and he did not appreciate it very much. "Remember, boy, you need me, or you will die cold during the night," she said, in that near calmness that would give just about anybody chills. Although Richard knew she was right, he needed something for his mental flight. Bianca's generosity was the only reason he was even alive at all. The next morning he was disturbed by Bianca's cell phone and felt like he woke up as if rising from a fall. "How was your sleep, dear wanderer?" she asked rhetorically. Richard thought at 18 he was a little bit too old to be called a runaway. Besides, she was not his mother. He was not sure what felt more like a sledgehammer, her grating voice that can cut through anyone like a sword, or because of his aching robotic arm and his suppressant withdrawals. That pain medication that he had started to ease was helping his recovery. "So let's talk money for a minute," he said to his dear fruit pie. "Do you wish to grab my only bullets?" Down here in Purgatory Road, they traded in bullets. "I only wish to know how much you think is reasonable to give me to take the medication that I need." She knew good and well that Richard was employed, and he may have to do what Malcolm was doing at the time in order to help pitch in. "That you can carry it around with you," she said, in that slightly less grating voice that was still grating, "to buy more of that powdery pill stuff." Though she knew that he needed it, she wanted to talk about drugs in a degrading tone. He needed to do something about her own addiction, however. "Well, I'm going out." Richard stood up naked. "Hey, cover yourself up with this blanket." It was his friend Malcolm and Bianca who were hanging out at the diner just down the road from their little shamshackle. Richard was, of course, being the little unattentive asshole that he was to the conversation, taking his pills to subdue the herky-jerky from his robotic arm. "At some point, man," Malcolm said to him. Then he snickered unamusedly. "You need to buy your own." Then he raised one of his eyebrows at the waitress, who placed his hamburger plate down on the table. "I will have a soda and make it a large," Bianca said, choking on a powder, causing Malcolm to growl at her because she spewed powder on his shirt. She puckered her lips mockingly at her ex-boyfriend, who smiled with a grimace. "Our brogie ran away from home yesterday," and then pushed Malcolm away, grabbing the soda from the waitress's hands. "Thanks a bunch. Now buzz off, will you? Me and Malcolm are having a moment." "A moment, right." "I can sense the false motherhood," Richard said. "You guys just can't get along, can you?" said Malcolm. Outside the diner, Ellen and Slefner walked inside to the sliding glass doors. To the table right beside them, the visitors sat. Them three tried not to pay any particular attention to these motherfuckers. and everything was at first all going to the plan. You will simply just eat quietly and then leave, they thought. Slessner eyeballed Malcolm's family with his grill, with a fake smile. But get this, Malcolm did not really seem to notice or care. Richard did not really understand how anyone could get used to this atmosphere with the tension that was boiling under the surface. Richard tried to pretend like he was not noticing Ellen, Slessner's girlfriend, at the time. He then switched to looking at his menu. "Hey, Richard, hurry up and order, will you?" said Malcolm, as quietly as he could muster talking to him. "Ellen, let's go get a to-go box," said Slessner. "Right," said Ellen. She was the wolf, and I was the sheep. An uploaded fairy prototype. Final part. Inside the barber shop, Richard was watching Ellen collecting tickets from two conspicuous-looking peers that he did not recognize from before. Did Slessner recruit new men? He had no idea, but there was something about them that gave him bad vibes. The ones renting the place still had not paid rent for that month, evidenced by the light that was buzzing in and out in the overhead. And so Richard barely saw Ellen sitting in the bleachers. At first, Richard saw the dog fight through the dream display, with the treads plugged into his forehead. He had a hard time not giggling. He couldn't help it, as the two robotic dogs looked like they were playing to him at this point. A special breed of pooch one would purchase on the black market in these parts, modeled after the pit bull and the wolf, but later evolving into a robotic version of the bear dog. He got the vibe that they must have had their share of some form of blood even before they've gotten into the ring. He didn't know that, of course, it was just a feeling, It was at the moment he started to feel a little bit of guilt. Not only for how he had treated Ellen in the diner, but also for those dogs in the ring. It's strange how you grow up one way and get used to another thing. Then it's abruptly switched up on you like a speeding train. And as much as you try to get used to the new life, there is still something deep inside that still gets to you. That feeling of being another dog in the ring. So to take those thoughts away, he tried to look at Ellen whenever he could. But he could not push his thoughts away from that dream he always wanted. A piece of electronic paradise. Not just a momentary paradise, that illusion of ocean sea. Something like eternity. Something that became very obvious was not here. He saw Slessner turn around to look at Ellen while monitoring his pit wolf in the arena. Malcolm's pooch was on the other side of the display. Slessner gave a thumbs-up sign like a confident rat. Nothing could take away this. This pooch that belonged to his best friend, or was the closest to being one, was like a hemp rope chomped through by sharp teeth. Ellen reluctantly gave a thumbs-up back to him with a toothy grin. Normally, Richard would not dig it, but, whatever, right? Ellen was still pretty enough. Richard tried to focus as much as he could through the game. The pit wolves pounced, then quickly clawed first strike. The conspicuous peers that were not part of either of the groups were sitting at a table and unplugged with trodes. It was the furthest place you could get from a normal audience seat. They stood at the back wall waiting. Something about them scared him. It unnerved him even more than Slessner himself. But what was it? He looked at the circular stage and to the multi-window pane display. He heard one of them make a statement to his friend to the side as he looked onward. "So you want to place a bet," he said, though Richard could barely hear him. "Oh, boss, isn't that—" his friend said. Richard could barely hear them as well. It felt like one of those whispers you would hear from someone in the dark. "Oh, relax. We're already," the guy who appeared to be the main guy. Then at a brief moment's glance saw him place the pipe in his mouth. I could barely hear the rest of his statement. Breaking the law anyway, doing this, technically. "Oh, I'd bet a 50, the other said. "Raise you double," the leader-like man said. "Triple. You're on. Let's watch the match." We knew even if our own dog lost one of its ears, a brew for another ear could in theory be generated from its gene code. Though it's not like we could have afforded it, we were broke inside and out. It was my friend Malcolm who felt more attached to his wolf, since, according to what he told me, he had largely grown up with it. "You're not going anywhere," Richard heard the man near the back say. Richard knew it. He knew it, you know. Then Slifner's dog jumped to the two cops. The remaining cops, owned by Richard and Bianca, misunderstood the gesture. It's an all-scale bloodbath. The pit bull started attacking everyone. One even tried to bite Richard's prosthetic, but Richard swatted at it. It was only Richard and Ellen who survived. Richard was abruptly thrown from his memory, hugged by Ellen, who had her face in his chest. She was shaking and getting his shirt wet. "Let's go somewhere far away and start a new life," Ellen said. Bound by trauma, they had nobody else to turn to. Richard thought the dogs cry out and we pout with agony, like lonely sheep torn apart by wild dogs. Him and Ellen were on the run, hiding out in another sector of the metropolis, beneath the floating city. "So where are we going to?" she said to him. "Someplace, somewhere, not here, anywhere," Richard said to her. "How about your limbs? Good enough. Why?" "I just wondered," she said to him. Richard could feel her behind him. He was not sure whether she was going to do to him. The previous incident the night before had made him a little bit antsy. "I know you were walking funny. I will be fine next." Even if he did not trust Ellen, he still wished he had met Ellen in any other circumstance other than this. It was your atypical date, but something. She was the wolf, and he was the sheep.